Springfield, Missouri, in the spring of 1992, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where streets were lined with modest homes and quiet lawns, and life seemed to follow predictable patterns. The air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, mixed with the hum of early evening traffic, and the town had a rhythm that most residents felt they understood intimately. In the midst of this ordinary environment lived Suzanne Streeter, a young woman of 19, whose bright eyes and easy smile made her a familiar presence in her neighborhood. She had graduated from high school the previous year and was navigating the delicate transition into adulthood, a time filled with both excitement and uncertainty. Susie's days were structured around part-time work, casual social outings, and helping her mother around the house. Her friends often described her as cheerful and dependable, someone who could light up a room with her laughter, yet had a streak of thoughtfulness that made her easy to confide in. She lived with her mother, but on that particular evening, her plans involved venturing out into the town's familiar streets with her best friend, Stacy McCall, who had a personality both contrasting and complementing. Susie's Stacy, 18, was vibrant in a different way. While Susie was soft-spoken and careful, Stacy carried a restless energy, a curiosity that often led her to take the lead in adventures and social escapades. She worked part-time at a local restaurant and often stayed late, finishing her shifts while the sky shifted from soft twilight into deeper shades of night. Stacy had a close relationship with her family, but she and Susie had forged a bond that went beyond familial ties, a connection born of shared secrets, laughter, and the simple comfort of having someone who truly understood you. On this day, after a long shift, Stacy had agreed to pick up Susie and return with her to the home of Cheryl Levitt, a 26-year-old woman who, in the quiet way that some adults do, had become a surrogate guardian figure for the girls. Cheryl's home was modest, unassuming, but within its walls existed the warmth of routine and care, a sense of stability that the girls often relied upon. As the late afternoon sun dipped behind the town's rooftops, casting elongated shadows across streets lined with budding trees, the three women's paths converged in a way that, in hindsight, seemed tragically ordinary. They spoke casually in the car, the air filled with the mundane chatter of friends discussing shifts, errands, and plans for the weekend. There was no hint of the darkness that would soon engulf them, no foreshadowing in the laughter that rippled between them or the light-hearted jokes exchanged. The streets were calm, with only the occasional passing car disturbing the serene flow of traffic, and the town, in all its predictability, seemed to hold its breath without anyone noticing. Susie and Stacy's journey to Cheryl's house was unremarkable in every way. They passed familiar landmarks, the small corner grocery store where Susie sometimes bought candy, the local park where children played as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, the quiet residential streets where neighbors waved as they returned home. Inside the car, the radio played soft pop songs, blending into the background as the three women spoke, laughed, and shared trivial stories. To any observer, it was a scene of ordinary life, a snapshot of normalcy in a town that rarely encountered anything extraordinary. But as the minutes passed and the familiar roads wound closer to Cheryl's home, an invisible tension, imperceptible at the time, began to gather in the shadows. When they arrived at Cheryl's house, the evening air had grown cooler, and the sky was painted with the faint glow of stars beginning to emerge. The girls stepped out, chatting and carrying small bags of personal items, and Cheryl welcomed them with the quiet hospitality that had long characterized her relationship with them. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dinner that had long since cooled, and the rooms echoed softly with the sounds of domestic life, a clock ticking, the hum of a refrigerator, the occasional distant bark of a neighborhood dog. Everything seemed ordinary, everything seemed safe, and yet, in that ordinary moment, the last pieces of their lives were falling into place before an event that would shatter the calmness of Springfield forever. No one could have predicted what was about to happen, The women were last seen moving about the house, preparing for the evening as they had done countless times before. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no suspicious cars, no raised voices, nothing to indicate that anything was amiss. It was only later, in the chill of the following morning, that the absence of these three young women would become painfully apparent. Their vanishing would ripple through the town like a shockwave, leaving behind questions that would linger for decades, theories that would multiply in the minds of investigators and residents alike, and a chilling mystery that would transform Springfield from a town of quiet routines into a place haunted by the unknown. The night settled over Springfield quietly, the usual sounds of a small town, distant sirens, the occasional passing car, the low hum of a late television, blending into a sense of normalcy that would soon feel hollow. Inside Cheryl Levitt's house, the three women moved through familiar routines, unaware that this ordinary evening would mark the last time they were seen alive. Cheryl busied herself in the kitchen, tidying the counters and putting away dishes while Susie and Stacy chatted softly in the living room, exchanging stories about work, friends, and plans for the coming days. Their laughter, light and unguarded, filled the spaces of the house, echoing off walls that had always provided a sense of comfort and safety. Outside, the wind rustled through trees, carrying with it the faint sense of spring blooms, and the streets remained quiet, unremarkable, as if the town itself were holding its breath. As the evening deepened, Susie and Stacy prepared to leave, intending to return home later after visiting Cheryl for a short while. They gathered their belongings casually, backpacks slung over shoulders, small items tucked carefully inside. Cheryl offered gentle reminders, light-hearted warnings, the kind adults give without realizing how fragile moments can be. The conversation flowed easily, with nothing in the tone or expression of any of the women to suggest that danger lingered unseen. The air was warm but not uncomfortable. The household was peaceful, yet in that calm lay an eerie prelude to the inexplicable. When the women finally stepped outside, the street lamps cast long, soft pools of light across the sidewalk, creating shadows that stretched unnaturally across the quiet pavement. They walked toward Susie's car, parked in the driveway, chatting as they went, unaware of the silent eyes that might have been watching. In a town where everyone knew one another, where neighbors were accustomed to waving and greetings, there was nothing immediately suspicious about their movement. Yet even the most ordinary evenings can conceal the extraordinary, and the difference between safety and peril often lies in the moments no one notices. The journey back through Springfield's streets was similarly uneventful, at least to the casual observer. The girls passed familiar landmarks, the grocery store closed for the night, the small park empty, the streets lined with houses in which families had long since retired for sleep. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar terrain as they drove, the soft strains of the radio creating a comforting soundtrack for what should have been an ordinary night. Within the car, the atmosphere was light, filled with jokes and conversation that had been commonplace between them for years. But outside, the world of shadows and quiet streets held secrets that would soon transform an ordinary evening into a nightmare that no one in Springfield could forget. By the time they arrived at Stacy's home to drop her off, it was late, and the streets were nearly deserted. Neighbors had retired to bed. The occasional glow of a television flickered through blinds, casting muted light on sidewalks and lawns. Stacy said her goodbyes, the warmth of friendship lingering in her words and gestures, and then Susie continued toward her own destination, the last steps she would take before vanishing. The car disappeared into the darkness, headlights retreating down quiet streets that seemed to stretch endlessly, empty and indifferent. No one would see Susie alive again. The first signs that something was amiss emerged slowly the following morning, when routines failed to be fulfilled and the absence of phone calls and messages became noticeable. Friends began to grow concerned, and families, initially hoping for simple explanations, started to sense that the missing women had not simply wandered off. Cheryl, usually confident and composed, found herself pacing, calling neighbors, attempting to reach them on phones that went unanswered. The calm of the previous night had vanished completely, replaced by an anxious tension that spread like wildfire. Law enforcement was contacted, and officers arrived at Cheryl's house, prepared for routine explanations, but confronted instead with a mystery that defied expectation. The home was undisturbed, every door and window locked, no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. The investigators moved cautiously, examining the rooms, retracing the girls' steps, questioning anyone who had seen them the night before. The more they looked, the less they found. It was as though the women had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind the familiar textures of daily life, the ordinary traces of existence, yet no clues to explain their sudden absence. By midday, the story had begun to spread beyond the home. Friends, classmates, and neighbors passed rumors and observations to one another, creating a network of concern that quickly escalated into panic. The absence of explanation fueled fear, and the ordinary town that had seemed so secure now felt fragile and uncertain. Every unanswered question, the last seen locations, the routine journeys, the familiar streets loomed larger than anyone had anticipated. Springfield, a town accustomed to the slow rhythms of daily life, had been thrust abruptly into a nightmare of uncertainty, and the normalcy that had defined the town only hours earlier felt like a distant memory, impossible to reclaim. As the search widened, the initial hope that the missing women might simply have gone somewhere voluntarily began to fade. The hours stretched into days, the town and the police struggling to find any trace of Susie, Stacy, or Cheryl. Witnesses were questioned, timelines reconstructed, and theories explored. Yet, nothing provided a clear direction. Every lead seemed to dissolve upon scrutiny, leaving behind only the lingering, incomprehensible reality of disappearance. By nightfall on the second day, the case had already transformed from a missing person inquiry into a mystery that would haunt Springfield and the nation for decades to come. The morning after their disappearance, Springfield awoke to an uneasy quiet that felt heavier than usual. Birds chirped as they always did, the sun rose over the rooftops, and cars trundled along familiar streets. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, a creeping sense of alarm had begun to spread. For friends and family of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl, the absence of the three women was no longer something to shrug off or explain away with mundane excuses. Calls went unanswered, doors remained closed, and the once comforting routine of the town had been pierced by a quiet, unrelenting fear. Cheryl's family, frantic with concern, began searching nearby streets, calling neighbors and relatives, and retracing the girls' steps from the previous evening. The house itself offered no clues. Every room was exactly as they had left it. The beds made, personal belongings untouched, kitchen counters clean. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, a silent witness to the events that had vanished from memory. No one could discern whether the women had left voluntarily, been forced away, or been taken against their will. The normal textures of domestic life, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of coffee, the soft ticking of clocks, suddenly seemed ominous, each ordinary sound amplified by the absence that hung heavy in the air. When the police arrived, they approached the house cautiously, but with procedural thoroughness, expecting perhaps a simple explanation, a miscommunication, a sleepover forgotten, or a routine outing. Instead, they were confronted with a baffling scene. Every door and window was locked, no signs of struggle or forced entry were evident, and the usual traces of human activity, footprints in the yard, fingerprints on doorknobs, yielded nothing unusual. Officers walked the rooms meticulously, cataloging the minor details of everyday life, while their minds wrestled with the larger, incomprehensible question: where had the three women gone? The first hours of the investigation were marked by both hope and frustration. Family members clung to the belief that the women might simply have wandered off or stayed with a friend, while law enforcement sought to construct a timeline from incomplete information. Friends were questioned, work schedules checked, and the girls' routines examined for clues. Neighbors recounted ordinary observations: a car parked in the driveway the night before, shadows of figures moving inside the house, the faint hum of conversation. Yet nothing pointed definitively to a direction. Nothing explained why three women, connected by friendship and proximity, could vanish without trace in a small town where nearly everyone knew each other. By midday, the gravity of the situation had begun to sink in. The case, initially considered a local matter, began to attract attention beyond the immediate community. Calls to authorities escalated. News outlets picked up the story, and the town that had been quietly going about its days now faced the weight of national scrutiny. The ordinary streets of Springfield, the parks where children played, the grocery stores where neighbors greeted one another everywhere, became a theater of unease, every familiar corner now tinged with suspicion. The townspeople felt the sudden fragility of their surroundings, as if the act of disappearance had peeled back a layer of reality, exposing the unsettling truth that safety was never guaranteed. Investigators tried to reconstruct the night of the disappearance piece by piece. They confirmed that Susie and Stacy had left work on time, that they had been seen by acquaintances, that Cheryl had been at home when they arrived. The challenge lay in the lack of concrete evidence: no car tracks in unusual places, no disturbances in the yard, no witnesses who could pinpoint the exact moment when the women vanished. Every detail of the home life they had left behind was preserved in meticulous order, as though some invisible hand had returned everything to normal immediately after their disappearance. It was this eerie perfection that most confounded the authorities, leaving them to wonder whether they were dealing with a carefully orchestrated abduction, an unexpected twist of fate, or something even stranger. As the day turned to evening, hope began to waver. Families and friends held vigils, driving through the town's streets in the fading light, calling out names into the darkness that returned only silence. The police expanded their search radius, canvassing the neighborhood, following up on tips, and checking local businesses for any signs of the women. Television crews arrived, broadcasting the story to a wider audience, bringing attention but also pressure to resolve what seemed an impossible puzzle. Rumors began to circulate, sightings that could not be verified, telephone calls with no answers, strange vehicles seen near the homes. Each new piece of information only deepened the sense of confusion and fear. By the end of the second day, the reality had solidified into an unshakable truth. The three women had vanished without a trace. The town of Springfield, once defined by predictable rhythms and familiar routines, was now consumed by uncertainty. Families clutched photographs, friends waited anxiously by telephones, and the community struggled to comprehend the unthinkable. The home of Cheryl Levitt, which had been a place of comfort and safety, now stood as a stark reminder of the mystery. 3 lives interrupted, 3 presences erased, and a multitude of questions left unanswered. The initial shock gave way to determination. Law enforcement coordinated search parties, followed leads, and began to piece together what little evidence existed. Each avenue explored seemed to branch into dead ends. Every witness question provided fragments of information that, while tantalizing, failed to illuminate the full picture. The investigation expanded beyond the borders of Springfield, and the story, gripping in its strangeness, began to capture the imagination of the public. It was a disappearance that defied logic, a vanishing that challenged conventional understanding, and an enigma that would haunt the town for years to come. The investigation into the disappearance of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl quickly became a sprawling, complex endeavor. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, moving through the town with methodical precision, canvassing neighborhoods, speaking to neighbors, friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual the night before. Every detail was scrutinized: the women's routines, the cars they drove, the places they frequented, even the timing of their phone calls. Detectives retraced the streets the girls had traveled, examining every corner, alley, and empty lot, seeking the faintest trace that might indicate where they had gone. Despite the intensity of the search, every lead seemed to dissipate into the ordinary fabric of the town, leaving investigators grasping for clues that did not exist. Phone calls began to arrive from concerned citizens and curious onlookers, each tip adding both hope and confusion to the investigation. A woman claimed to have seen a car parked near the girl's house, though she could not remember the make or model. A teenager reported spotting figures walking in the shadows, but the description was vague and contradictory. Officers followed every lead, no matter how small, yet the puzzle only grew more impenetrable. The missing women had seemingly evaporated, leaving behind no footprints, no struggle, and no indication of force. The normality of Springfield had become a canvas for speculation, the familiar streets and houses, now tinged with a sense of danger that had never been acknowledged before. Media attention intensified as the days passed. Reporters from regional and national outlets descended upon the town, broadcasting the story of the three women who had vanished without a trace. Newspapers ran front-page articles, detailing timelines, describing the girls' appearances, and interviewing family members and neighbors. Television crews filmed outside Cheryl Levitt's home, capturing the grief and anxiety of those waiting for answers. For the first time, Springfield's quiet streets became part of a national narrative, its residents suddenly thrust into the spotlight as the public sought understanding and perhaps closure from a mystery that seemed to defy explanation. Detectives faced pressure to produce results. They created timelines, analyzed witness statements, and explored potential suspects. But every theory had its flaws. Was it the work of a stranger, a calculated abduction by someone unknown to the women? Or could it have been someone familiar, someone who knew their routines intimately and exploited their trust? Police investigated ex-boyfriends, acquaintances, and other local residents whose presence in the town might have intersected with the missing women's paths. Each interview provided minor details, but none offered definitive evidence. The frustration was palpable. Every dead end intensified the anxiety of both the investigators and the families waiting desperately for news. Local law enforcement also collaborated with state and federal agencies, hoping to broaden the scope of the search. Canvases were extended beyond Springfield, reaching nearby highways, wooded areas, and rivers that might have been used to conceal someone or something. Dogs were brought in to detect scents. Officers examined drainage areas and abandoned buildings, and volunteers combed the countryside in the hopes of discovering a clue overlooked in the initial search. The effort was massive, but the results were minimal. It was as if the women had vanished into thin air, leaving only questions and fear behind. As days turned into weeks, theories began to multiply. Some suggested a random act of violence. Others speculated about a planned abduction, the meticulous removal of 3 individuals to prevent detection. Investigators considered whether the women had left voluntarily, perhaps running away together, but nothing in their backgrounds suggested this possibility. Friends and families attested to their reliability, their habits, and their commitments. Their disappearance was an anomaly, one that did not fit the patterns detectives knew from years of experience, and yet the absence of evidence did not diminish the urgency. It amplified it, driving search efforts and intensifying media scrutiny. The emotional toll on the families was immense. Days spent waiting for news turned into sleepless nights, filled with uncertainty and fear. Parents scoured every corner of the town, hoping for a sighting or a message. Friends organized search parties, calling out names into the dark and walking streets that had once felt familiar and safe. The entire community seemed to share in the grief, a collective anxiety that made every night heavier and every morning more tense. Even as police worked tirelessly, the lack of answers created a pervasive sense of helplessness. Despite the challenges, investigators remained committed to solving the mystery. They examined old reports, checked recent criminal activity in the area, and even considered possibilities that initially seemed improbable. Every possibility had to be explored. Every theory, no matter how unlikely, had to be tested against the facts. The disappearance of 3 women in a small town was extraordinary, a case that demanded extraordinary effort, and the investigators were determined to leave no stone unturned. Yet as days turned into weeks, the limits of available evidence became painfully clear, and the investigation, no matter how meticulous, remained frustratingly inconclusive. The people of Springfield, meanwhile, continued to live under a cloud of uncertainty. The ordinary streets, parks, and homes were haunted by the awareness that 3 of their own had disappeared, and that the answers might never come. Each passing day without resolution deepened the mystery, strengthened the grip of fear, and heightened the desire for answers that could never be fully guaranteed. The town, once defined by routine and familiarity, now existed in a liminal space between ordinary life and unrelenting suspense, the memory of the missing women shaping every thought, every conversation, and every glance down a familiar street. As the investigation progressed, the absence of definitive answers allowed the imagination of the public to fill the void. The story of the missing women became fertile ground for speculation, and every new rumor, every minor clue, seemed to take on an outsized significance. Friends and neighbors recounted small incidents that, in isolation, would have seemed inconsequential. A stranger's car parked too long on a quiet street, a passing figure glimpsed in shadows, a fleeting conversation overheard at a convenience store. Each detail was analyzed, dissected, and debated, yet none brought the investigators closer to a concrete resolution. The mystery deepened, its weight growing heavier with each day that passed without clarity. Theories abounded, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Some suggested a random act of violence by a transient criminal, someone passing through Springfield and seizing the opportunity presented by the ordinary lives of 3 unsuspecting women. Others speculated about a more calculated plot, an abduction orchestrated by someone who knew the girls' routines intimately and could exploit the trust inherent in small-town life. Law enforcement considered each theory, exploring connections and questioning suspects, but nothing produced conclusive evidence. The very normalcy of the women's lives, the routines, the familiarity, the safety of home, made their disappearance all the more perplexing. Public attention intensified the pressure on investigators. Local newspapers ran daily updates, highlighting every lead, every speculation, and every new development. No matter how small, national outlets picked up the story, turning Springfield into a focal point for armchair detectives and true crime enthusiasts across the country. Letters and calls flooded the police department with tips, some credible, others based on hearsay or wishful thinking. Detectives waded through these leads with meticulous care, aware that false information could distract and delay the search for the missing women. Yet for every promising tip, there seemed to be 10 more that led to dead ends or contradictions, amplifying frustration and the sense that the case might never be solved. False leads became a constant challenge. A claimed sighting of the women at a local bus station drew search parties that found nothing. A reported vehicle, matching descriptions from earlier days, proved to be unrelated. Phone calls suggesting ransom demands or intentions of harm were traced and dismissed as hoaxes. Each incident, while ultimately unproductive, added to the tension, creating hope that was repeatedly dashed. Families, investigators, and the community were caught in a cycle of anticipation and disappointment, the uncertainty gnawing at their resolve as the days turned into weeks and then months. Psychologists and criminologists were consulted to offer insights into the disappearance. Experts discussed patterns of abduction, the rare but documented instances of calculated removal of multiple individuals, and the psychological impact on both victims and communities. They considered whether the women could have left voluntarily, acting out of fear or a desire for escape. But the evidence contradicted such conclusions. The women's connections to friends, family, and work were strong. Their routines were consistent. Their behaviors reflected reliability and trust. The probability that all 3 would leave without warning, without preparation, and without communication seemed vanishingly small. The investigation was forced to focus on external threats, but the absence of concrete leads left this path frustratingly barren. Media coverage both helped and hindered the investigation. On one hand, it raised awareness, encouraging witnesses to come forward with potentially valuable information. On the other, it amplified speculation, creating a fog of competing narratives that complicated the search for truth. Every new theory, whether propagated by reporters or locals, demanded attention and validation. Some suggested involvement by cults, others by organized crime, and some proposed that the women had fallen victim to a serial offender whose presence in the region had previously gone unnoticed. None of these theories produced evidence, yet each contributed to the sense of dread that pervaded Springfield. Amid the growing speculation, investigators revisited the home, re-examined possessions, and questioned individuals who had interacted with the women in the days leading up to their disappearance. Every seemingly minor detail, an unusual phone call, a late-night errand, a disagreement overheard by a friend was scrutinized. Yet the house itself, untouched and orderly, offered no clues. It was as though the women had been plucked from existence, leaving behind the textures of life, but not the substance. The lack of signs of struggle, combined with the absence of a clear motive, made the disappearance both infuriating and terrifying. The town of Springfield, once secure in its routines and familiarity, now operated under a pervasive cloud of fear and uncertainty. Streets that had seemed safe became sources of suspicion. Neighbors glanced more cautiously at passing strangers, and conversations were frequently punctuated by concern for the missing women. The case had transformed the fabric of the community, threading anxiety, vigilance, and grief into daily life. For the families, the emotional toll was unbearable. Nights were sleepless, days were heavy, and hope was a fragile, flickering thing. Every passing week without resolution cemented the reality that these three women had vanished in a manner that defied comprehension, leaving a hole in the lives of those who loved them and a mystery that would endure for decades. Decades have passed since the disappearance of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl, yet the case remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Springfield and in the annals of American missing person investigations. Time has done little to diminish the questions that linger, nor has it softened the impact on the families whose lives were irrevocably altered by that spring night in 1992. The homes they left behind remain in the memory of those who knew them. The streets they once walked still echo with the absence of three ordinary women who vanished without explanation. For Springfield, the case became more than a local tragedy. It became a defining story, a reminder that even in the most familiar and secure places, the inexplicable can occur. The families, though forced to continue with their lives, have never stopped searching for answers. Anniversaries of the disappearance are marked quietly, often with private gatherings, remembrance photographs, and the hope that something, however small, might emerge. Friends and relatives maintain online forums, sharing memories, theorizing, and occasionally revisiting leads that have long since grown cold. For them, the missing women are not mere names in a file. They are living presences in memory, eternally woven into the fabric of daily life, whose absence is felt as sharply as it was. The day they vanished, law enforcement continues to regard the case as active, even after decades of limited leads. Advances in technology, from DNA analysis to digital forensics, have created opportunities for re-examination of evidence that were unavailable in 1992. Investigators review old files, compare new information, and consult with experts on missing person cases, hoping that even the faintest clue might finally illuminate the truth. Yet despite these efforts, the core mystery endures. Where did the women go, and what forces took them? The absence of physical evidence and witnesses has left a gap that cannot easily be bridged, creating a lingering frustration that resonates through the hearts of those still seeking justice. The case has also entered the realm of public consciousness, discussed in true crime books, podcasts, documentaries, and media articles. Each retelling keeps the memory alive, rekindling interest and occasionally producing new information or leads, though none have yet solved the mystery. The story of the Springfield Three serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of safety, the unpredictable nature of life, and the deep human need for closure. It challenges investigators and communities alike to confront the unsettling truth that some disappearances are never explained, that ordinary lives can be disrupted in ways beyond understanding, and that unanswered questions can endure across decades. For Springfield itself, the impact is woven into the culture and consciousness of the town. The disappearance transformed familiar streets and neighborhoods into spaces of speculation and remembrance. Community members speak of the night with reverence and unease, recounting the events to newcomers as part of the town's collective memory. The case has prompted increased awareness of personal safety, missing person protocols, and the importance of vigilance, influencing both law enforcement practices and community engagement. In this way, the absence of 3 women has left a lasting mark, shaping not only the town's history, but also its approach to the unknown and the unresolved. Ultimately, the story of Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl remains unfinished. There is no resolution, no definitive explanation, no final chapter that offers comfort or closure. Their disappearance is a reminder that life can change in an instant, that ordinary moments can shift into extraordinary uncertainty, and that some mysteries defy comprehension. Yet, in the absence of answers, the enduring legacy is one of remembrance, vigilance, and the persistent hope that someday, somehow, the truth may emerge. Families, friends, and the town of Springfield continue to honor their memory, keeping alive the names, faces, and stories of 3 women who vanished into the unknown, ensuring that even in disappearance, they are never truly forgotten. The Springfield Three endure in memory and narrative because of the unanswered questions they left behind. Every theory, every rumor, every investigation is a thread in the tapestry of their story, a story that refuses to conclude. While decades have passed, the mystery remains alive, challenging assumptions, inspiring reflection, and reminding all who encounter it that some absences leave a void impossible to fill. The town of Springfield, shaped by this profound and unsettling loss, continues to look back on that fateful spring with a mixture of sorrow, hope, and the persistent human desire for understanding, a desire that may never be fully satisfied but will never fade.